I'm extremely honored and excited to introduce to you today Sharifa Rhodes-Pitts. She's the author of Harlem is Nowhere, A Journey to the Mecca of Black America, which was named among the 100 most notable books of 2011 by the New York Times Book Review, and was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award. It's the first part of a planned trilogy on African Americans and utopia. The following books in the trilogy will concern Haiti and the Black Belt region of the southern United States. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Chimurenga, Bidun, A Public Space, Creative Time Reports, Harper's, Essence, and Vogue, among many others. She has received grants and awards from Creative Capital, the Whiting Foundation, the Rona Jaff Foundation, and the Lannan Foundation. I first came across Sharifa's work in the fall of 2017 through her 2004 piece Lennox Terminal in Transition magazine. This piece was later developed into her much-acclaimed book Harlem is Nowhere. Sharifa is a writer who, in her own words, begins by taking the past personally. Her work therefore navigates the troubled waters that combine history and personal narrative, necessarily intertwining her storytelling with history and place. It importantly engages the problems of storytelling and symbols and self, which are relevant to our world today and the potential to unlock the possibility for future utopias that rest within the present. Please join me in welcoming Sharifa Rhodes-Pitts.
Thank you, Sahar, and thanks to everyone that's been involved in organizing this. The day that I got this really nice email inviting me to take part in this, I was having a symposium in my head on the very same question. So it felt, what's just fallen? Is that mine? No, it's another mic. That's
fine.
Okay. So as I said when I responded affirmatively, I'd be happy to work this out in public. So you're going to, my presentation is in two parts. One is a slightly more formal excavation of some of the questions, perhaps from a different, this feels like it's going to fall down. Can someone address? It's just mobile. Okay, thanks. And then I wanted to open up into some of the questions that were posed to me directly, because I found myself wondering if I wasn't answering them quite, so I wanted to be very direct about that, and in order to also have a conversation. So I'll begin. I want to tell you some things, and at the same time, I cannot. Two are stories I was told in the course of my ongoing research in Haiti, and one is something that happened to me there. Since the times of the tellings and of the happening, I have kept these things to myself. What was told to me was offered by way of explanation, once in response to a question I had asked, and once in response to a question I had not asked. What happened to me, I have told only to two people, both because I wanted them to help me understand it, but in the telling, I gained no further insight. Otherwise, the meanings of these things have been contained in the moments of their occurrence, bound by what was happening there and then, in the moment of disclosure or occurrence, bound also in the cases of what I was told by a tacit agreement that I would not repeat what I heard. So I haven't, but I'm going to now. I'm going to tell you. Is my mic off? A reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 10, verse 3. And when the seven thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, seal up those things which the seven thunders uttered, and write them not. John of Patmos did what he was told. even as time caused him to be known more by what he did write, what was unsealed, what he was either entreated by an unearthly voice or by an internal voice to pass on. "Tell me, who's that writin'?" the song asks, and then answers, "John the Revelator," eventually renamed not for the place he was from, but for the act of telling. I wrote one book based mostly on the things people had told me and what I overheard, and other things I read about and then went back to books to corroborate and sometimes to contradict. The process of this writing was first a tribute to having been told, to the telling, which is also to say, to the relationship. These relationships predated the writing, invited it, provoked it. If I had gone to Harlem less in search of experience than somehow in the midst of one, an experience of history, if one could venture that, and I suppose I already did venture that. What is less clear is when it turned from experience to story, and where in the story did I belong? Having arrived in the middle of one story, toward the end of another, and at a beginning of my own. This is one way to think about knowledge and tradition. At the time when I stumbled into stories or had them thrust upon me, I was not thinking of the Seven Thunders and likely would not have heeded the call of that voice. Before his withdrawal, Lord Chandos of Hofmannsthal letter said, "I thought of setting side by side the most memorable sayings which, while associating with the learned men and witty women of our time, with unusual people from among the simple folk, or with erudite and distinguished personages I had managed to collect during my travels. With these I meant to combine the brilliant maxims and reflections from classical and Italian works, and anything else of intellectual adornment that appealed to me in books, in manuscripts or conversations, the arrangement, moreover, of particularly beautiful festivals and pageants, strange crimes and cases of madness, descriptions of the greatest and most characteristic architectural monuments, and many other things." Imagining himself in conversation with a great tradition, he, quote, "longed to disappear in them and talk out of them with tongues." Bounded by time and place and the people with whom I found myself, in whom I saw myself, situated variously as we were at the story's beginnings, middles, and ends, I attempted to honor what seemed most precious and rare and fleeting about all of it. The moment I had stood across from or next to a stranger or a new friend with my ear very close, this moment of transmission, perhaps this was what I wanted to document above all, a coming to knowledge, coming to know and be known. In being told I had received not just information, news, opinions, memories, but relationship. And when I later put those relationships onto pages, I hesitated only slightly about whether it was my right to have done so. I was talking out of them with tongues, like Chandos wished. I hoped that I could say, along with Hurston's Phoebe, "Their tongues are in my mouth. I can speak their sentiments for them." I had been there, it had happened to me. I had not been there, but it had still somehow happened to me also. Whether I was happening to it did not cross my mind exactly, except that I can admit the moments when I was most happening to the place, that is, by acting on it and in it and with others, were the moments when I wrote the least. When the book was published, the stories did not stop. I stopped writing them. I kept being told stories by people who had come to hear me tell them about my book, such that I found myself often saying that the people should then write their own books. And even though I do experience an overwhelm bordering on nausea when I contemplate the great many unprocessed oral histories that have been visited upon the world in the decades-long project of History from Below, the idea of my book existing along these many others did not bother me at all. In reckoning with the onslaught of all of the stories my book could not contain, the ones that preceded my book, and the ones who felt like they'd been ignored by my book, and the ones that would go on after, serve as corrections, retractions, and appendices of my book, I could be at once exhausted by this and relieved by it too. It had the effect of making one feel very narrow and yet at home in the largeness of the space you could not possibly hope to fill. Instead, I could imagine myself as one in a series of scribes who, in a different time, would have been writing down a chain of events with little attention to significance, along with the weather and the record of the harvest and the appearance of an eclipse. And out of these, it would then be someone else's task to make a story. I was living in Haiti when I started reading Sylvia Wynter seriously, and it seemed right that I'd waited until then. She is concerned with a beginning of a story, perhaps the beginning of the story of the overrepresented Western European idea of what it means to be human, and that's a most simplistic rendering of one of her central ideas. And the New World encounter that had caused this idea, this story, to overthrow not just peoples, but their possibilities. And not just their possibilities, but their stories about the experience of being human. And I'd be doing a disservice to those who haven't yet read Wynter if I left you thinking that by story she means the kind that say, well, this happened to me, and that happened to me, and then. Because I really mean to say episteme, and how the shipwreck of Columbus on the coast of Quisqueya is the moment when the Western European story of what it means to be human got it to stake its place in the ground, along with the cross planted. I had come by then to realize that the story I had gone there to find had the same point of origin. The particular mental renovation that was visited on me by reading Sylvia Wynter in Haiti had to do with a kind of site specificity. I recently told a friend about having gone to the place where Columbus had landed and how, in effect, nothing had happened there. There was nothing there, or rather, what was there was an experience, but not a story. Traveling for 3 hours by motorcycle over a rocky, desertified coastal plain to reach it was an experience, but not a story I want or need to tell. My eyes were shocked open for a few hours after having arrived from passing across the jagged terrain. These wide eyes looking through a portal in the seawall adjacent to a Catholic school planted on what names itself as the sites of arrival. There was a goat in the courtyard and a rusty iron cross. Benjamin links this decline of storytelling to the decline of experience. This decline is signaled by silence. Nothing is passed from mouth to mouth, let alone from tongue to tongue. He tells us something else about this older way of knowing and what is coming to replace it. The value of information does not survive the moment in which it was new. It lives only at that moment. It has to surrender to it completely and explain itself to it without losing any time. A story is different. It does not expend itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength and is capable of releasing it even after a long time. Seal up these things. The 8th century master of Buddhist Tantra, Padmasambhava, is the founder of a lineage of hidden teachings. They are hidden in the student's mind or concealed within rocks, water, or air. These lessons, called terma, or treasures, are to be preserved for the future. And there's only a few ways that they can be accessed, sort of in a progression from mind to mind, from sign to sign, and finally, quote, hearing lineage of ordinary individuals. So the moment of mouth to mouth or tongue to tongue is the last, the final, the least complicated way to transmit this knowledge, this treasure. And the adept would strive to unseal and to discover the treasures, not just in a stream or in a mountain or in a rock, but eventually in his own mind. Perhaps this is a way to think of research. Now might be a good time for the obvious question, the one about why I would choose to interrupt this very passage Benjamin speaks about, from mouth, to tie it up in my tongue. Write them not. Perhaps it links back to Winter in a roundabout way. Winter, whose project of undoing is a grand one, an apocalyptic one even, and thus an ending in search of a new beginning, indeed in search of a story that could save the world. To cross that terrain with Winter is to go in search of what cannot be known because of the destructions that began in 1492 and worlds that did not come about as a result. But this also delivers us to our task, the stories which must be told to avert what she rightly calls the unparalleled catastrophe for our species, the catastrophe of 1492 to present. Perhaps along the way, we might visit a moment when certain things could not be said. I must have been asking Monsieur Laguerre. He said it in response to my curiosity about. Perhaps my question had presumed to know too much. I had read the reports and I had walked around the country roads of wondering if that was the place where. I had talked to one of his descendants, bearing the family name, an aquiline nose, but knowing little else. It was there in the courtyard when he told me that during the time of, there had been and this had been the reason for, and that it still went on today and would be deployed when necessary. And it was a few months earlier when I asked John Walter about, and he told me that it was, and that he couldn't tell me. I don't remember having pressed, because pressing is not really my orientation to the world, but after a bit of hesitation, he told me and that it was, and that it stood for, and that I only knew it, and then if they could, and be saved. And the night after we'd gone to, leaving the 4x4 parked in a riverbank where people were chopping rocks that Roland told me would be carried to Okap to build foundations for houses, we walked up the side hill whose muddy red clay made us slide. Eventually I must have taken my shoes off in order to make a better footing, reaching out for Roland in front, leading the way, and Charlie behind, finding a child to give us directions before we eventually came to the clearing that was the village. We had gone there because Roland told me that it was the place where I had learned to, and that he had been instructed in this by. We waited while the mambo attended to the other visitors. I played with a baby whose mother was sat in a circle of women a bit down the hill. When it was our turn, we crossed the water in order to enter the caves, and Roland called out in salutation, and I did not call out. I followed what the others were doing as the mambo led us around, as if we were being introduced, but it felt as if I had not made a proper introduction. This is. Hours later, those names woke me out of my sleep, like a set of incandescent lights spelling out, demanding to be greeted. If I had thought for a second that it was a dream, this was quickly pierced by the convulsions of my son in the bed next to me beneath a mosquito net, and I gathered him up and took him to the adjacent bathroom where he vomited, and it happened again, which was when I decided to, and spoke in a clear internal voice, and then it stopped, and he didn't remember anything the next day. Two of my students from Pratt are here, and I've just finished a seminar on invisibility. So we're gonna get a little actually you can do this part. We were reading two pieces together, which Gianna said did not have anything to say to each other, and I wasn't satisfied to let that go. So maybe that's why I had to come back to them. The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action by Audre Lorde, and The Aesthetics of Silence by Susan Sontag. I was thinking about these two pieces in terms of different calls around silence. Certainly the one that Lorde offers is one of danger. She says, the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. And of course, Sontag says, silence is reticence to the nth power. Lorde talks about the cause of silence, and this cause being something that women of color especially, but women generally must exit in order to do our work in the world. She says, each of us is here now because in one way or another we share a commitment to language, and to the power of language, and to the reclaiming of that language which has been made to work against us. And so much of that particular Lord piece, I think, would be used to mobilize the kind of voicing that it was very common in our time. Say her name, me too. And in reading her now, I find myself wanting to talk about this question of silence, especially as I find myself making arguments on its behalf. I've lost my, I love, and I probably quote too much to people in this room, Hélène Cixous on the noise machines from which one cannot imagine that justice or truth will appear. The noise machines are more and more sonorous. And my search is for a silence that can rest between the noise machines and the call to turn language, silence into language and action. It is not a totalizing silence, but maybe a postponed knowledge in the style of Padmasambhava, one that we must find within our own meaning along our own terms, and that the treasure will be revealed within. For Chandos, he spoke of his condition as one that would remain locked up in him. And even as I think about the end of, sorry, my pages are out of order a little bit. Oh, okay. Not telling stories, there's one story that I want to tell you. It's not so much the whole story, but what comes at the end. It's a story called The People Could Fly. Does anyone know this story? No. Certainly it's one that in the tradition that Benjamin speaks about has been passed from mouth to mouth. I was told it as a child in a book that I then bought for my child and told it to him. It's a story about African people who fly off of the plantation. Only the ones that remember that they can still do this and remember the words of how to do it are able to escape. The storyteller Virginia Hamilton collected it. The people could fly. They say the people could fly. Say that long ago in Africa, some of the people knew magic, and they would walk up on the air like climbing up on a gate. And they flew like blackbirds over the fields, black shiny wings flapping against the blue up there. Then many of the people were captured for slavery. The ones that could fly shed their wings. They couldn't take their wings across the water on slave ships. Too crowded, don't you know? The folks were full of misery then, got sick with the up and down of the sea, so they forgot about flying when they could no longer breathe the sweet scent of Africa. Say the people who could fly kept their power, although they shed their wings. They looked the same as the other people from Africa who had been coming over, who had dark skin. Say you couldn't tell anymore one who could fly from one who couldn't. One such who could was an old man, call him Toby, and standing tall yet afraid was a young woman who once had wings, call her Sarah. Now Sarah carried a babe tied to her back. She trembled to be so hard worked and scorned. The slaves labored in the fields from sunup to sundown, the owner of the slaves calling himself their master. Say he was a hard lump of clay, a hard glinty coal, a hard rock pile, wouldn't be moved. His overseer on horseback pointed out the slaves who were slowing down. So the one called driver cracked his whip over the slow ones to make them move faster. That whip was a slice open cut of pain, so they did move faster, had to. Sarah hoed and chopped the row as the babe on her back slept. Say the child grew hungry. That babe started up bawling too loud. Sarah couldn't stop to feed it, couldn't stop to soothe and quiet it down. She let it cry. She didn't want to. She had no heart to croon to it. Keep that thing quiet, called the overseer. He pointed his finger at the babe. The woman scrunched low. The driver cracked his whip across the babe anyhow. The babe hollered like any hurt child, and the woman fell to the earth. The old man that was there, Toby, came and helped her to her feet. "I must go soon," she told him. "Soon," he said. Sahar couldn't stand up straight any longer. She was too weak. The sun burned her face. The babe cried and cried. "Pity me, oh, pity me," say it sounded like. Sahar was so sad and starving, she sat down in the row. "Get up, you black cow," called the overseer. He pointed his hand, and the driver's whip snarled around Sarah's legs. Her sack dress tore into rags. Her legs bled onto the earth. She couldn't get up. Toby was there where there was no one to help her and the babe. "Now, before it's too late," panted Sarah. "Now, father." "Yes, daughter, the time has come," Toby answered. "Go, as you know how to go." He raised his arms, holding them out to her, singing "Come, Yali, come, Baba Tambe," and more magic words said so quickly they sounded like whispers and sighs. The young woman lifted one foot on the air, then the other. She flew clumsily at first, with the child now held tightly in her arms. Then she felt the magic, the mystery. Say she rose just as free as a bird, as light as a feather. The overseer rode after her, hollering. Sarah flew over the fences. She flew over the woods. Tall trees could not snag her, nor could the overseer. She flew like an eagle now, until she was gone from sight. No one dared to speak about it, couldn't believe it. But it was, because they that was there saw that it was. Say the next day was dead hot in the fields. A young man-slave fell from the heat. The driver come and whipped him. Toby came over and spoke words to the fallen one. The ancient words once heard and never remembered completely. The young man forgot them as soon as he heard them. They went way inside him. He got up and rolled over on the air. He rode it a while, and he flew away. Another and another fell from the heat. Toby was there. He cried out to the fallen and reached his arms out to them. Whispers and sighs, and they too rose on the air. They rode the hot breezes. The ones flying were black and shining sticks, wheeling above the head of the overseer. They crossed the rows, the fields, the fences, the streams, and were away. "Seize the old man," cried the overseer. "I heard him say the magic words. Seize him." The one calling himself master came running. The driver got his whip ready to curl around old Toby and tie him up. The slave owner took his hip gun from its place. He meant to kill old black Toby. But Toby just laughed. Say he threw back his head and said, he, don't you know who I am? Don't you know some of us in this field? He said it to their faces. We are ones who fly. And he sighed the ancient words that were a dark promise. He said them all around to the other in the field under the whip. There was a great outcrying. The bent backs straightened up. Old and young who were called slaves and who could fly joined hands. Say like they would sing, but they didn't shuffle in a circle. They didn't sing. They rose on the air. They flew in a flock that was black against the heavenly blue. Black crows or black shadows. It didn't matter, they went so high. Way above the plantation, way over the slavery land. Say they flew away to freedom. And the old man, old Toby, flew behind them, taking care of them. He wasn't crying, he wasn't laughing, he was the seer. His gaze fell on the plantation where the slaves who could not fly waited. Take us with you. Their looks spoke it, but they were afraid to shout it. Toby couldn't take them with him, hadn't the time to teach them to fly. They must wait for a chance to run. Goodbye, the old man called. The old man called Toby spoke to them, poor souls, and he was flying gone. So they say. The overseer told it. The one called master said it was a lie, a trick of the light. the driver kept his mouth shut. The slaves who could not fly told about the people who could fly to their children when they were free. When they sat close before the fire in the free land, they told it. They did so love fire flight and freedom and Talon. They say that the children of the ones who could not fly told their children, and now me, I have told it to you. A few days before I got the invitation to speak here, I wrote this in my notes, my revolving notes that are trying to find a book. But I was thinking about the word flight and the feeling of flight and the way a book can have this feeling. Not only a fleeting feeling, but a way a book can enact a marinage. Part of this is allowing for rumor and also for things that are not able to be grasped. To follow the ungraspable like a hound, this is to take on the role of the dogs trained to follow black flesh. Instead, to take for true what was left on the scent of the wind, and what was left was departures. They had gone, and what we can know from that is what is possible. History and the possible. That is, telling what we know of what has happened and what we know of what might happen. To take for true. What is known for sure is that they were no longer slaves. What is the other position? To realize that in telling it now, or attempting to tell it now, we inhabit both the position of the ones left behind in possibility, and also the ones who are the inheritors of the flight. If we are worthy of this inheritance, and we are not all worthy. The poet Aimé Césaire has a poem called, well, it's really badly translated, so I feel like it's a problem to talk about it in English, and my French is not really great enough to recite it. The translation is the verb mariner, the verb mariner meaning to make marinage, to enact flight, which is a big part of my study of Haiti, partly a study of a story of how to write it. So he's writing actually to the Haitian poet René Depeste, who at the time when he wrote this was aligned with communists and with the line of how to be a poet in the revolution. So Césaire, as a staunch, at the time, surrealist, is ribbing at his friends, but also inviting him along. Some excerpts. Comrade Depressed, it is undoubtedly a very serious problem, the relation between poetry and revolution. The content determines the form. Bach, Depeste, the poem is not a mill for grinding sugar cane, absolutely not. And if the rhymes are flies on ponds without rhymes for a whole season, away from ponds, under my persuasion, let's laugh, drink, and escape like slaves. Thank you. So I brought the questions because I feel like I wanted to have them in the room with me from the first email. Shall I read them to you?
Yeah.
Okay. Some of the questions we want to raise include, what do stories convey as evidence? That was on my mind, but I didn't get to writing about it. How does that change when stories are the material of fiction versus nonfiction, artwork versus critical essay, experimental or activist text versus objective reportage? What is the relationship between stories and truth, stories and history? Are stories adequate to convey the complexities of historical traumas or contemporary conflicts, or do they stand in only as symbols, small pieces of a greater drama? So I want to talk about those questions with you, in addition to your own questions that I'm sure you have, and perhaps interpolating them through what I shared. So thank you. Well, for me, those stories, particularly about Harlem, that became Lennox Terminal, which became Lennox Terminal because Mike Vazquez was my editor, and we were having daily conversations, and I was telling him the stories that were happening to me, and he said, "You need to write that." That's exactly what happened. It was no more complicated than that, ever so many years ago, and so it wasn't an experience of trauma in that case, it was an experience of kind of like a effervescence. Like I was overflowing with stories, and I had to tell someone, and then I had someone who was kind enough to say like, no, this is something to write, like write it down. But I don't know that I have that relationship to stories anymore. Do I, Mike? Yeah, I mean, that was like something I did for the first time today in this room as an experiment. Because I have been like just living with this idea of that there are stories that have other purposes besides being told. And that, yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that. And that's, I think that's been that's the kind of the curtain that's falling. that has a sense that like not every story is a harvest, but some are for keeping, or some may be for telling once, or some may be for telling in a kind of crisis, but then realizing it doesn't change anything by having told it. Now 3 people have heard that story. They have a purpose among the ones who know already, right? And I have to speak in like total transparency of this like being something I'm working out. And what I'm working out is, I mean, it's very illustrated by these particular instances because they are stories of resistance. And it causes me to think about a kind of, to question some idea of a publicness or a public sphere or something in a larger space in which all things can be worked out. And certainly the seminar that I created last year and taught again this year about invisibility was provoked partly by the political moment we were in, and thinking about like the fact that there will be times when things should not be disclosed in order to resist. And that even though we have sort of, I think partly in the room that we're sitting in is shaped, not this room, but the kind of the ethical room and the kind of political culture that we're sitting in is shaped by one of display and discussion and outwardness. But I don't think that's like actually the space where a lot of political work can happen, especially for resistance, especially from having studied the history of Mirene, for instance, which is all about having to be quiet and invisible and disappear and how to appear in order to get what you need and to go back to take it to someone who needs it. So I guess I've just been interested in what does that mean in history? What does it mean in writing? And what might it mean in our politics today? Yeah, it's not resigning, but I think there's also, you just, at the same moment that you're speaking out, which I also was not alive for, but it's a moment that my parents lived through partly and were activists through, is one in which the underground functioned in order to like make things possible. And we have those histories now, we have some of the histories. Something I was thinking about as I was working on this was a moment, it didn't kind of like rise to the surface, but it does now kind of in conversation, was many years ago, I wrote a failed series of articles for a leftist magazine that won't named about reparations. And in the process, and this was like at a moment in the early 2000s when this like, there was a lot of, there was not like a Atlantic magazine cover story about it, but there were a lot of like lawsuits and marches and protests. And in interviewing different people that were involved, many of them being veterans of earlier movements. And part of what was active at that moment was the veterans of many different movements kind of like washing up into this one movement and finding like one more thing to fight for. And with that, like the contradictions of earlier moments kind of being questions for me as a, what's the word? Just a child of that moment. Product, yeah. I wanted to know, like, why did what failed? Like, what went wrong? Like, what were the contradictions and the betrayals and that I need to know this in the interview. I really I was kind of pushing on these questions. And this person who I think had other issues, but was really staunch about he didn't need to tell me about that, and that's how movements get undermined, and all this I got kind of ranted at about this. And I remember actually it's probably one of the few times, I didn't do interviews that much in general, but it was one of the few times that I actually got off the phone and started crying. And it was partly the sense of some sort of personal attack, which was lodged in there, but also the lack of access to something that I just couldn't know. And when I think about that now, I have a different feeling about it. Some of it is just the remove of time, but, and actually that is actually where trauma comes into the story for me a lot, because the way I now regard that kind of refusal and rebuttal is partly through a lens of understanding the trauma of that generation, and their inability to process and the contradictions and failures and betrayals and deaths that were lived through and visited upon others internally in the movement, and violence. All of that is my way of understanding this silence around and silencing of those questions. What you say about not wanting to shut down libraries and books and knowledge, that's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm thinking about, I think I'm thinking about two things. One is maybe most clearly expressed in those what are just notes, but feel very central to a way of pursuing the work I'm trying to pursue now, which is and I think it was something I was interested in even in Harlem Is Nowhere, which was the kind of multivalence of a different ways a book can be talking within itself to itself, to a time that has not happened yet, to times that have come before, but particularly this idea of even in writing history to have to relinquish knowing. And that's something that many people are working on, and I find my cues from a lot of people that I can speak of, whether it's Saidiya Hartman or Carla Ginsberg or many others. But to be able to deal with the blanks is something I'm curious about. I don't have my historiography books next to me, but I came to that term from studying historiography, which is the only graduate study that I did, and I didn't take a degree. It was during my Fulbright year. I went to Scotland to study historiography, the only one person in the class, but they don't give that degree anymore even. So it's not a good example of what they can do with the degree, I guess. Anyway, so that it comes from that, it comes out of, I think, a Marxist framework of in British Marxist historiography in the 70s as a term. And then it's really bizarre, but I have this real hatred of oral history as a project.
Why?
I feel it's just the sense of all these stories sitting in boxes, and no one is doing anything with them. And that's aside from the ones that are just really messed up, which for instance, the ones of the WPA slave narratives, which are useful and really crazy. Just if you go to the there's just a great chasm between often the transcripts and then what the interviewer wrote as the report. Or the notes will say so-and-so was a good proper mammy, the last, it was just really extraordinary, racist, white supremacist, lens on people's lives. So those are, and I was just rereading some, I guess it was some Ginsberg this morning, just thinking about this conversation and, sort of the idea that, we take for granted that these archives are flawed. That's kind of Archive 101. But I guess it's the idea of something, the sort of a value that's placed on the action of collecting that then is not transmitted into what happens to it, I find distorted somehow. And a great deal of a great deal of energy and resources are put into these collections. And then they're like coffins. I don't know. It's strong language that that I hate oral history. But it vexes me. I don't know what to do with it. Maybe I will one day come upon some oral history that like enlightens me, or maybe Mike is shaking his head, so he doesn't think so.